Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Let me start with a quick question. And I know Rich ended his presentation before lunch with the same question, so I'm going to start mine with the same one. For how many of you is this your first Stellafane? A couple of you, 2, 3, 4. Great. I would feel right raising my hand also, even though I've been to 51 of them, 50 and today's 51. Because every time I come through the gate and I pull into the field, and especially early this morning before that deluge of rain came, I walked up to the summit. Every time I round the bend going up there and I see first the turret telescope and then the pink clubhouse, it's like it's the first time I was here, all over again, right? I was 13 when I first walked up that hill with my mom back in 1969. And it's just like I relive it all over again every time. And I'm sure many of you feel the exact same way. It's such a magical place, Stellafane. The fact that we're marking the centennial of the Springfield telescope makers who gave birth to this is really just a monumental occasion. Great historical significance. You and I wouldn't be sitting here right now, for that matter, you and I wouldn't be amateur astronomers right now if it weren't for that event 100 years ago. Because that literally was the birthplace of amateur astronomy as we know it. The birthday, the birthplace. Because before that, only people who owned telescopes were highly affluent folks who could afford spending, back then, hundreds, thousands of dollars back then to buy a refractor that likely was manufactured in most of them in Europe and so forth. But because of Russell Porter, okay, and the rest of the Springfield telescope makers that brought astronomy, amateur astronomy, down to the masses, that's why we're here today. So what I want to do in this presentation is to trace the story, like I said, the story of Stellafane. Who's who behind the pink? The pink is the nickname for the pink clubhouse, if you don't know that. Who's who behind it? Because some of the names, like Russell Porter, you're likely, even those who are here for the first time, very familiar with it. But there are some other names that you probably don't know that contributed not just to the early days, but all the way up to and including present day. So I just want to review some of them, some of the personalities that, again, contributed to us being here today. And let me turn it on. There we go. Have to begin with Russell Porter, of course. Okay. First off, before I begin this, let me preface by saying I want to thank the Springfield telescope makers website. Ken Slater, the webmaster, does a masterful job with that website. So outstanding job with that website. And quite honestly, I stole a lot of the pictures you're going to see off of that website. So I got to credit them before I go forward. Okay. Also, I need to credit Bert Willard, who we'll visit with him toward the end of this, historian for the club, and his just amazing biography of Russell Porter. So if you don't have that book, you got to get it. And if you do have that book, you got to read it. And if you do have it and you have read it, you got to read it again, because there will be a quiz at the end of all this. An amazing work, that biography of Russell Porter. And some other photos of people like Rich Sanderson unknowingly contributed a bunch of pictures to me, and a few of the other people too. But we'll go along. Anyway, to Russell Porter. He was born in 1871. That is, according to Bert, that's the earliest known photograph of a young Russell Porter. Again, reprinted from his book. He was the youngest of 5 children. At an early age, he started to show a real aptitude for art. This, in fact, is one of the earliest sketches that he made. Obviously nothing to do with astronomy, just a simple fishing boat. But again, at an early age, he really started to show this knack for being able to capture things accurately on paper. And that was going to serve him well much later in life. He graduated from Vermont Academy in 1891, went on to Norwich University, studying engineering, and also to the University of Vermont. Later on, he studied architecture and art as well at MIT. That transfer to MIT proved to be a pivotal moment in his life, because in 1892, while he was a student at MIT, he attended a lecture there by none other than Robert Peary. Okay? Because back then, Arctic exploration was the next frontier. Okay, the next frontier. And Peary, of course, obviously being so well known in that area, proved to be a captivating lecturer, to the point that Porter caught Arctic fever, and he caught it pretty badly. because within a year he had signed up, and for the next several years, all these expeditions. Greenland in 1893, Greenland again in 96, 97 to Baffin Island, Labrador, Northern Greenland. 1901 and 1903, two separate expeditions called the Ziegler Polar Expeditions, where he actually was more or less staff at this point. He had a pretty good curriculum vitae of past expeditions. He was in charge of making astronomical observations, so they know longitude, latitude, their location, and so forth and so on. That caught the astronomical bug. He became interested in astronomy because of that. But the expedition in 1893, they were stranded, and this is a view of the ship over here, the America, I believe it was. They were stranded for 3 years, okay, in obviously very unacceptable conditions. So I was complaining about the rain this morning. Nothing compared to this, okay? But you know what? Even though the ship, yeah, there was steamed out of America, it was crushed and it sank, they still were all rescued. And in fact, he wasn't quite over with his Arctic fever yet. He came back and went to Denali in Alaska in 1906. But that was his last trip. He wanted to settle down. And so he settled down in Port Clyde, Maine, which if you're familiar with the state of Maine right over here, I don't know if you can see the pointer or not, but it's right on the coast, right over that way. Okay? That's where he settled down. Bought a plot of land. He named it Land's End, and that's a plaque that he actually made. Sorry for the light, you can't really read it, but it says Land's End, 1906. So he named that portion of the town that he bought. He tried to start an art colony up there, but it failed. Didn't catch on at all. And so he went on to, because again, art and architecture came together here, he started to design cottages along the water, many of which still exist today. He married the town's postmistress, Alice Marshall, and they had a daughter named Caroline. Well, in 1910, James Harkness, who was a friend of the Porter family from here in Springfield, he had heard of Russell's interest in astronomy. And so he sent him a stack of magazines, Popular Astronomy, which was the magazine of the day back then. And so he sent all of them to him to try to foster his interest in the hobby. Well, it turns out, and there's Harkness right over there, Harkness was the president of Jones and Lamson, although he started actually much later, kind of rose his way up to president, like so, started as a plant superintendent. How many of you are staying at Harkness' house? So you're trespassing on his land, but that's where you're staying. He went on to build in 1910 a brilliant telescope, a refractor, okay, 10-inch Brashear objective. This refractor that allowed him to look at the sky from the comforts of an inside heated shelter while the optics were still outside. So absolutely brilliant idea. Well, he also gave Porter, among other issues, this issue of Popular Astronomy. And you'll see that there was an article, March 1910, okay? That's the leading page, led with an article by William Pickering on Halley's Comet. But deeper in, there was an article right over here by Leo Holcomb named Speculum Making. Well, speculum, mirrors for telescopes. The article itself, just 3 pages long here, the article itself did not tell you how to make a mirror, not step-by-step instructions how to make a mirror, but it told you why you want to. Okay? So it was a bit more subjective, not as objective as he had wanted. So Porter actually contacted him, the author, and said, hey, I want to do this. How can I go about it? Well, he was nice enough, Holcomb I mean, to send him a copy of this book over here called Glassworking. And by Paul Haslick, as you can see. Glassworking, though, that's a very broad topic, glassworking. Well, if you take a look at the table of contents over here, it talks about glass tubing, it talks about blowing bulbs and flasks and fancy glass gilding and this, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of very non-telescope topics. But you get to the one chapter over here, chapter 7, and now hand-working a telescope speculum. And that's what Porter read. And he read it from start to finish, I'm sure multiple times, and he came to the conclusion, hey, I can do that too. And so before you know it, he set to work. The size of the first telescope mirror, how large was the first mirror, it's lost to history. Nobody knows. Okay? But we do know that he just finished the first, and he started on the second, and then the third. And he started to make more mirrors than he could build telescopes for. So he was really caught by the bug again. Just like he had Arctic fever, and now he had telescope fever, making mirror after mirror after mirror. Well, of course, he was interested in learning more and so forth and so on, and so he kept going through those articles in Popular Astronomy, and knowing, of course, how we have, Harkness made this turret telescope down here in Springfield. He said, you know, I can do that too. He came up with a brilliant design up in Port Clyde in his house, built an offshoot to the house itself with a turret telescope, an inside telescope. He built a study. And this was an article that ran the March 1916 issue of Popular Astronomy magazine also, and it showed his illustration over here, showing the design and how here you are in the observing room, but the optics are on the outside. That looks awfully familiar if you've been up to the turret telescope here. That is the turret telescope here. I mean, the philosophy behind it, certainly. But that was 1916 rather, was the article. Well, World War I came along, and after World War I ended, the Porters moved back to Springfield, pretty much at the urging of Harkness, actually. He worked with Harkness at Jones and Lamson. Together they developed a really, it's fascinating if you're into it all, looking for these patents, an optical comparator to measure the accuracy of screw threads. Because prior to this, it was all done pretty much subjectively by the observer. But here you can now do it objectively with this comparator. And all kinds of patents were awarded and so forth and so on. At the same time, he spent a lot of his free time, though, designing telescope mounts, designing telescopes, making them, and talking to Harkness about all this, because the two of them would, kibitz back and forth about astronomy and telescope making specifically. Well, Harkness was elected governor of Vermont in 1920, so he moved off, or at least his focus kind of moved off for the moment. But Porter kept on talking to now other people, both at Jones and Lamson, but also other townsfolk as well. Well, he was, of course, infectious, and he got to talking to so many people who became interested in astronomy that they decided to hold mirror-making classes, led by Porter, to build telescopes. And this was the first class. It was August 12th, 1920, and there you see Porter over here, labeled, you can see. Oscar Marshall, key name coming along here. Oscar Fulham, another key name in the early history of the Springfield telescope makers. And Rich Sanderson mentioned earlier, all the men except for one woman, Gladys Piper, her name was. Nobody really knows what size mirror she made. They do know that she did successfully make a mirror. It is in the museum, you're right, come to think of it. What size is it? 4.5 inch? Okay, all right. She was not one of the original Springfield telescope makers. This was Genesis for the club, Springfield telescope makers. She wasn't a member because she moved before that happened. Okay, so she kind of moved off, unfortunately, and went on to a different job, a different location altogether, out of Springfield. But this was the genesis for the Springfield telescope makers. Originally, one of the first discussions was, what are we going to name the club? Well, at first the consensus was the Telescope Makers of Springfield. That's kind of a clunky title, they thought. Didn't really flow. And so they decided to move around with it and became the Springfield Telescope Makers. That's the original membership right there. Okay. December 7th, 1923, to be exact, the club was formed. So that's our birthday. That's amateur astronomy's birthday, as we know it today. Was December 7th, 1923. All these people played key roles in that club. Talked a little bit about Porter already, but all of them contributed to making Stellafane, the clubhouse, designed by Porter, very reminiscent of the cottages that he made up in Maine, in Port Clyde. There it is there. So Stellafane later contracted to Stellafane for Shrine to the Stars. Well, one of the first things you'll see in this early black and white picture, obviously, that it's missing a couple of things that we're used to today, but because black and white, we can't see the color, okay? And so that's one of the questions that always comes along. So why the heck is it pink, of all things? Well, again, the club's website does a very good discussion about that based on Burt Willard's historical studies and so forth. Two reasons. First off, the club was running out of money because they had spent so much on lumber and so on and so on. And so they had to come up with paint. So they went to the local paint shop and they said, can you contribute some paint to our project? Well, apparently the owner, according to this rendition of the story, said, sure, I'll give you paint. Here's a bunch of free paint. They got up here, they opened it up, it was at that point they discovered it was pink. Don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, and so it's pink to this day. Another version of it, Porter specified it, he wanted it to be painted spruce pink. Anybody familiar with spruce pink? Spruce pink is almost white with a very, very subtle hint of pink. Spruce white. Okay. Well, Porter said I wanted white, but he had to go out of town. And so when he came back some time later, apparently they didn't hear the spruce part of it. They just heard pink, and we have pink. So which story is correct apparently is not, one versus the other, but it's an interesting story regardless of how it came about. But it's pink to this day regardless. John Pierce, one of the original members up there, he was the vice president for the club when it first formed. He was an architectural engineer by degree. He was a high school teacher, though, by vocation. As a matter of fact, take a look at the span of years from 1919 to 1956. He was director of Springfield High School's cooperative co-op course that they had. They took a look at skills, such as sheet metal working, machine tool work, electrical, auto repair, so forth and so on. That was his vocation. He, though, went on to author articles that appeared in Scientific American magazine, as well as contributed to the first volume of amateur telescope making. We'll talk about that book and how significant that was in just a little bit. But he was a very active promoter for amateur telescope making, in addition to Russell Porter, of course, a very active promoter of it, not just verbally, but in writing as well. He also wrote articles in a magazine, and quite honestly, until I started to research this talk, I had never heard of it before. Everyday Science and Mechanics magazine. Anybody ever hear of that before? I never heard of it. Okay, but he did articles on making a whole series of articles, which you can find online, by the way. All you do is just Google Pierce, and then in quotes the title of the magazine, and you'll get all these reprint articles. Just the text, not all the illustrations, but all the text will be there. But they covered telescope mounts and diagonals, some astrophotography, early version of astrophotography, observatories, so forth and so on. Now, he died in 1958, and in 1958, the Sky and Telescope, Robert Cox, who's a name familiar to probably a lot of us old-timers, he wrote how Pierce was one of the big three behind the amateur telescope-making movement in America. The other two, of course, being Porter, of course, but then Albert Ingalls, which we haven't talked about yet, but I'm about to bump into him. I love this design. This is one of Pierce's original design over here in one of the articles. That reminds me so much of a design in All About Telescopes by Sam Brown that Edmund published, I don't know, 30, 40 years later. In fact, that I tried to make, but unsuccessfully, I might add. Oscar Marshall was another name. He was the Secretary Treasurer of the club at first. I love some of these sketches you'll see. They're all by Porter. Okay, some of the sketches of some of the folks that are mentioned here. He first became interested in not astronomy, but optics at a very early age. He bought a spyglass somehow. He adopted it for surveying. He surveyed the entire town of Springfield, again, at a very early age. Well, probably the most detailed map of the town up to that point. Porter heard about this. He had moved back to Springfield from Maine at that point. He heard about this, and so he met with Marshall because he was so impressed with how detail-oriented he was. Well, long story short, he joined the telescope-making movement in 1920 also, making an 8-inch telescope, and I'm not sure that's the original scope, but that's a scope with him sitting next to it. He also went on to build, it's thought to be the first prototype of the Springfield mount that Porter designed with the fixed eyepiece location, and that's a shot of it there. Ernest Flanders, we're in the Flanders Pavilion right now. That's him. Okay. There was also Ralph Flanders, his brother. Ralph Flanders was also an original member of the club. However, history doesn't record that he actually ground the telescope mirror, which is a prerequisite for being a member of the society. So I don't include a profile of him, although he was a U.S. Senator from Vermont who was one of the first to try to take down Joe McCarthy with the whole communist movement back in the 50s. But Ernest Flanders over here, he also worked at Jones and Lamson. He invented a machine for grinding screw threads. Remember they did the optical comparator? Well, that's what they were optically comparing, were the threads from this machine that he designed. He had an interesting change in careers. He was the head of the Springfield Hospital from 1944 to 1957. Like I said, it's kind of a strange career shift. And one of the founding members of the club as well. And there he was. Rich Sanderson took this picture back in, you remember what year that was, Rich? Is it on there? 81? Yeah, 81. He was one of, I don't know if he was the last, but he was certainly one of the longest surviving original members of the club. And Albert Ingalls. Albert Ingalls had heard about this little group up in Vermont. Because again, Porter was published in Popular Astronomy magazine, and so word started to spread, and Ingalls finally heard about it. And so he contacted Porter. Porter met him in Manhattan, but then Porter said, well, you know, to really get a feel for Stellafane, you have to go to Stellafane. And so he convinced Ingalls to come up here. Now, it wasn't a matter of just hopping in the car and going up I-91 to exit 7. Oh, no, you know, you were going on muddy horse paths and so forth. So I bet that was quite a rollicking trip. This was another meeting of them years after the initial. But Ingalls was really key for promoting amateur telescope making in the pages of Scientific American, rather. In fact, after this initial visit up here, cover story for Scientific American in November of 1925 led off with a profile entitled "The Heavens Declare the Glory of God," and that was really the first international introduction to Stellafane. And the response to this article was huge, completely unexpected, but it was huge. Ultimately, starting in February and then March 1926 issues, Porter was commissioned to write a two-part follow-up to that, more about telescope making. Those articles really proved to light the fuse to the telescope making movement. People just couldn't get enough of it, not just here in the US, but literally around the world, to the point that it led to the writing of Amateur Telescope Making, released the first volume, and it also led to the first Stellafane convention, because the response was so great that the Springfield telescope makers decided to invite all readers of Porter's works and the rest as well, in the various magazines and such, to come up here July 3rd and 4th, 1926. So that was the first Stellafane convention, just 2 years, just 2 nights, right over the 4th of July weekend. I like this. This is the little flyer that ran, and it's also on the STM website. I like I highlighted a couple of things. A Night with the Stars at Stellafane, Supper by Redfield. Well, that sounds Redfield. From Manhattan? Paris, perhaps? No, he was a member of the club. Okay? He was really known, interestingly enough, for his oyster stew. Where do you get fresh oysters in Springfield, Vermont? It's not in the Connecticut River. I know that, so I'm not too sure how that works. But he was really known for that. Okay? He was known for a couple other things, too. And down below, the second highlight says, "Good hotel at Springfield, fine camping at Stellafane." I don't know if they had porta potties back in 1926. But anyway, fine camping at Stellafane. So Redfield. That was Everett H. Redfield. Okay? You see him in this very famous photo. He's in the circle right over here, wearing the chef's hat, because he was the chef. He's the one who prepared the meals for the rest of the club members when they would meet up here, or for the entire convention, apparently, although it wasn't a terribly big showing, in 1926 as well. This fellow, Everett Redfield, very interesting individual, because not only was he a chef, he was also a poet. And it was tradition in the early years of the convention that a poem that he read, would be read at every convention. And it was called The Telescope Maker's Dream. And I don't know when it was last read at the convention, but it's going to be read now. Okay? Fortunately, I'm pre-recorded myself, okay, so I don't have to stumble over the words. But let's see if I can get this to play.
I dreamed that the Springfield Telescope Club took a trip to the planet Mars and established ourselves on a mountaintop from which to view the stars. That we carried a monster telescope, a scope of most wonderful power, and watched the stars and worlds roll by for many countless hours. And the sights we saw in realms beyond the vision of this world's eyes were a ceaseless wonder and endless source of pleasure and surprise. When the people of Mars inquired who we were and where was the land of our birth, we turned that telescope around till it pointed at the earth, and told them to look and see for themselves the land from whence we came. And if all went well, we hoped to return to our native land again. And when they had looked to their heart's content and examined the whole world o'er, they said such a wonderful telescope they had never seen before. They saw great cities and towns on the land, and ships that sail on the sea, and questioned us closely of all that they saw, and wondered that such things could be. Then a wise old professor said, "Tell me, I pray, what are those black bugs that I see? They run round so lively and in such great droves. They're a new kind of insect to me. Please tell me their names and habits of life, for we have no such insects on Mars." Mr. Fulham spoke up and said, "My dear sir, those insects are Henry Ford cars. We dwelt with those people a year and a day and found them a people of worth. But then we were homesick and thought it was time that we should return to the earth. We bade them farewell, and they wished us bon voyage, and left them with sincere regret. We felt well repaid with discoveries made, and their kindness we'll never forget. Of our journey back to earth, I have nothing to tell. I felt a hard bump on my head. I suddenly woke. 'Twas the end of my dream. I found I had rolled out of bed."
And that is Chef Redfield sitting in the pink clubhouse looking out the door, the entrance to it. That's a really cool poem. I read that, I thought, wow, that's pretty creative. I like the ending, rolled out of bed. I thought that was very, very good. Well, of course, come 1930, the club was becoming more prosperous after the 1926 gathering and subsequent years. And in 1930, they took on a huge job of making the Porter Turret Telescope. It's also 1930 at the convention, although it's not known who made it, the Stellafane, the little man sign, was first hung above the door to the clubhouse entrance. As it's written, Pierce brought outside a wrought iron sign made by one of the local boys. We tried different locations for it, and finally decided to hang it directly over the central north door. And it's been there ever since. Joseph Johnson, another early member, not one of the originals, okay, but one of the early members. This picture of him here, which again I grabbed from the STM website, 1936, here he is arriving at the summit in his car. Okay. He became governor of Vermont also from 1955 to 1959. But even after his governorship ended, he maintained certainly an active presence here, well, at every convention. As a matter of fact, my first time here in 1969, the Twilight Talks, which were delivered up at the summit, he offered welcoming remarks. Okay, so he always kind of kicked it off. And I was a 13-year-old kid. I'm like, who? Who's this guy? But he was governor of Vermont back 10 years or so earlier. But he always started that off, followed by Walter Scott Houston and whatever. There he is, 1977, one of his last visits here. He was visiting, viewing, I should say, telescopes that were displayed up on the hill, including this, an early 16-inch Dobsonian from the Amateur Telescope Makers of Boston. If you take a look, you go again to the Stellafane website, take a look at the history pages. You're going to see not all, but many of the flyers from past conventions. And I always focus in on the people behind it So you take a look at the names of the judges, both 1973 and 1984, just a couple of sample years, and it's a real who's who of the leading telescope makers and amateur astronomers of that day. Like, for instance, one, Alan McIntosh, that Rich mentioned this morning. Alan McIntosh was a great advocate of the Maksutov telescope. That he formed the Maksutov Club, as it was called. They used to meet Saturday afternoons under the tent behind the clubhouse, which is where the afternoon talks were always presented back at the time. Founded back in 1956, and I think Rich showed this picture, but here he is over on the left-hand side, and some other names like John Gregory was one, Warren Fillmore was one, many others as we go as well. This led to his publishing a newsletter or circular, as it was called, for 20 years, starting in the 50s, until he moved back, after retiring, he moved back to England, and the circular stopped. However, it ultimately led to Wilman Bell collecting these circulars and creating 2 volumes, 1 and 2, Advanced Telescope Making Techniques, that both are still available, I believe, today. Also, a member of the Maksutov Club, Harry Kozin, his name was, and I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I did by way of his cartoons. Every year he would come up with, at first it was a 1-panel cartoon, then went to a 3-panel cartoon called The Tripod. But they were pretty clever, some of these. Like, yes, Mrs. Gazer, I'll check and see if there's a prettiest telescope category. You know, stuff like that. Another one, this was 1969, led off with a tribute to Apollo 11. And here, this guy's selling moon rocks for $2 each, and the judge saying, sorry, we don't allow commercial displays here. You should win the prize for the most economical and portable telescope. He's holding a mirror, and just like so, and he's holding the eyepiece in his hand. I think that's kind of funny. Wow, look at that solar prominence. Holding a cigarette lighter in front of the telescope. How about this one over here? Oh, the fork once belonged to Paul Bunyan. Top right one over there. I think of all of them, though, my favorite one has to be the top right over here. That's a caricature of Walter Scott Houston. And this guy over here, you see a comet going across, you have a UFO or auroras. This guy's looking up. Guess there's no observing tonight. There's Scotty Houston with the pipe, ever-present pipe in his mouth, and so forth. And this, I believe, was the last one that he produced. Again, a sign of the times from 1974. Yikes, there goes the speaker. So, again, kind of funny stuff. Again, all on the website. Funny stuff. I always got a kick out of them every year. Oh, no, let me go back. Sorry. This one's also a good one. Great idea of placing a mirror on Mount Scottney. You have a close-up of the sun on a big projection screen above the pink clubhouse. Ralph Dakin, another well-known name. He was one of the perennial judges up here. He was an optical engineer at Bosch and Lomb. Anybody ever hear the Dakin-Barlow? That's the Dakin in the Dakin-Barlow, right there. It's an interesting story. He actually didn't design it. He actually stumbled upon it quite accidentally because Bosch and Lomb was apparently throwing out some surplus optics, and he said, hey, I wonder if I hold these two. And all of a sudden, the Dakin-Barlow was kind of born from that accident. He was a member of the Rochester Academy of Science, frequent MC here, gave innumerable tent talks over the years as well. He once grabbed, this is sort of telling of the person. Okay? He once ground a 6-inch mirror in 2 days after a student member of the club at the Rochester Academy of Science, after a student member dropped and cracked her homemade mirror just before her school science fair. And he saved her and made the mirror. So pretty nice, pretty good guy, you know, from that. That's him on the left, Alan McIntosh in the middle. Another perennial favorite here was Ferdinand Barr, who was big into Cassegrains and so forth as well. George Keane, anybody ever hear of him? If you're an astrophotographer, he wrote one of the first Bibles of astrophotography. Okay? He grounded his first mirror as a 6-inch back in college. Built many telescopes, including this 20.5. That's his most famous. They had an observatory. Again, he was up toward the Rochester area as well. Worked at Eastman Kodak for 37 years. Author of, among other things, that book, Stargazing with Telescope and Camera. Again, one of, if not the first serious treatment of astrophotography for the amateur back then. After retiring, he started to build camera obscuras, which are, in a sense, almost like turret telescopes, a little bit. He has installed them in Central Park, Rift Observatory out west. Here you have a tower, a mirror is there, it shines whatever you're looking at down into the room where you are, and it goes onto a screen. So I guess maybe more terrestrial than, although you could certainly do it for solar and lunar, I suppose, maybe, but it was more of a terrestrial application, I guess. Henry Paul, another name that a lot of us old-timers will remember. Dr. Henry Paul, although the doctor was not in astronomy, he was in nutritional biochemistry from Cornell, as a matter of fact. Author of 3 classic books. These are the 3. Okay? You've got to have these in your library. Even today, we're talking 50 plus years later, you still learn a tremendous amount from any of those 3. For me, when I wrote my book, Turn the Universe Through Binoculars, I mean, that was one of my Bibles. So they talked all about the inner workings of binoculars and so forth. That was key to my research for that effort, certainly. He's best known for a 12.5-inch reflector that he designed, but Cave Optical out in California made. And the unique thing about that, well, really 2 unique things. First off, quartz optics, which back in the day, Pyrex was the way to go. Quartz optics, number 1. But number 2, it was a pier in an observatory, this S-shaped pedestal that it's on. Isn't that weird? We've always learned, I always thought you want to keep center of gravity more or less over the center of the pier. But there it is offset a distance. And here actually is an original drawing of his, and I highlighted the S-shaped pier to it. And the question was put to him, well, why are you doing that? And from what I gather, this is a quote from him, an angle, or a sheep's leg he called it, pier, permits clearance for large astro cameras replacing heavy counterweights on the deck axis. So back in the days when you had big heavy cameras, that was one way to use them productively for essentially a counterweight by doing that. So that's a pretty clever design actually for back in the day. Paul Vallely, very famous amateur telescope makers, of course. First attended Stellafane in 1954. I was minus 2 years old when he attended his first Stellafane. At the age of 15, sounds a lot like me though. Okay, mine was 15 years later from his first, 1969. But my parents drove me up here also. They dumped me off and they took off. I'm up here on my own. And that's kind of what his parents did also. Within 10 years though, he became a judge. So that's something I can't claim. Very, very smart individual, brilliant in terms of optics and so forth and so on. During his career, he worked, this is an interesting list, NASA's Orbiting Astronomical Observatory, Skylab, Apollos 15 through 17, Voyager 1, Voyager 2, and the New Horizons spacecraft. So he worked on, his company made the optics and so forth for NASA for those efforts. John Pierce, John M. Pierce was the original vice president. John C. Pierce, his son, took over for him when Dad kind of moved on. Son came along. He was a teacher by trade also, and he was not only the historian of the club back at the time, instructed newcomers to mirror making and so forth and so on. He also began a tradition with the evening talks at Stellafane. Okay, you had a welcoming, and then you had, they called it back then, Stellafane lore. Started in 1959 until 1970, when he passed on. Okay, quite unexpectedly. I like Stellafane's website. This is interesting. Stellafane's website. Here we have him at the mic over here. See, like I say, we used to all gather in front of, if it wasn't raining, in front of the turret telescope. A screen was going to be hung over here in later years, and we'd all just listen on the hillside there to, in this case, Pierce. And here's what the website says. He was known to throw in a certain amount of theatrics in his talks. The most memorable was the year he decided to address the crowd from the roof of the Porter Turret Observatory. He was up top over here, standing on top of the roof. That's kind of different. Charlie Thayer, everybody, I'm sure most of you remember who Charlie Thayer was, right? Charlie Thayer, he was always the guy with the public addresses and so forth. He decided to pull the ladder down and he left Pierce up on the roof, stranded. I guess somebody finally convinced him to put the ladder back in place. He died unexpectedly only at age 56. So that was up to 1970. Well, 1971 came along and there was this huge gap to fill. You know, what are we going to do without Stellafane lore? It was a very popular feature for 11 years, 12 actually, at conventions. So what do we do? Along comes, to me, an astronomical superhero. Along comes Walter Scott Houston. And he picked up the ball and he started his own shadowgrams. But I get ahead of myself. He was author of Deep Sky Wonders column in Sky and Telescope for nearly half a century, 1946 to 1994. In 1969, my first convention, I walked up to the hill here, and all of a sudden I see this yellow building off to the side. I'm like, what the heck is that? Turns out, that's it right over there, he built this on site. It was a solar observatory. You go inside behind the curtain, and pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Well, that was Houston, was behind the curtain. He had this rear projection screen, and you had this huge projection of the sun on the rear projection screen. I'm like, holy, well, I'm not going to say what I said. It was unbelievable. I couldn't get over it. I didn't know this until researching this. The parts, the pieces for it, acquired by tearing down the woman's bathroom the previous day. That's kind of interesting. I wonder if people had any say in that, but there that is. He also wasn't a bad Frisbee player, I found out in 1975, because in the old field, a bunch of us kids were engaged in just a game of Frisbee, going back and forth, and he joined in. So there he is, with his ever-present pipe, doing a pretty good catch of a Frisbee. There I am returning it, and there he is throwing it back again. So pretty good Frisbee player also. My astronomical superhero was playing Frisbee with me. I died and gone to heaven. He took over Pierce's job creating the shadowgram beginning in 1971. Another ever-present member up here, Roger Tuthill, your astronomical friend. He sold solar screen filters and went on really introducing the concept of Mylar solar filters, really the first to do that. And he also went on to create a lot of other different products and so forth. But at the heart of it all, he was an amateur telescope maker. And to prove that, in 1969, he was larger than life, certainly at conventions, he coined the phrase a Stellafane year. In other words, a lot of us, how many days are there till Christmas? I hear my grandchildren ask me, how many days is Christmas? I say, how many days till the next Stellafane? Right? That's the Stellafane year. And he coined the phrase. In 1965, he brought up a 20-inch telescope. There's another shot of it over there. This is back when people made 6 and 8-inch reflectors. Right? 1973, he had a 12-inch telescope, 12.5-inch. And of course, Tuthill Towers is named in his memory. Well, 1969 to 1972, by 1969, the turret telescope had kind of fallen into a state of disrepair. Here was a punch list of things that were wrong with it in 1969. Clock drive didn't really work well. The gear clutch box leaked oil. You can see the oil leaking down the north face of the building in this picture. Again, some slewing motion didn't work. Friction roller didn't work correctly, and the mirrors actually were not as good as they probably could have been, and so forth. And so a group of people, in the form of Jim Daly, who led the charge, Burt Willard, Alan Rohrer, Charlie Thayer, Mike Libra, and Ken Leather, they led the charge to get it fixed up to where it is today. And if you haven't had a chance to look through the turret telescope, at some point you got to look through it, assuming it stays clear. Beautiful, beautiful images. I mean, the optics now, because of Ken Leathers, master optician, the optics are just without parallel. And it got all cleaned up, and it finally was reopened in '72. Doug McGregor. Doug McGregor was a very nice man. He was president of the club, but more importantly, he was the master of ceremonies for years at the evening talks. And he just had a very charismatic presence of him. It captured everybody. Sadly, he died in a car accident in 1988, way before his time, and left a huge gap. It really affected the club. It affected me personally because, again, he was just such a nice guy. It affected the club. And so the club decided to, in his honor and in his memory, to build the McGregor Observatory. And of course, there we are today with it. So, but what a wonderful monument for somebody. And again, of his character and so forth was really terrific. Inside, of course, we have the Shootman telescope, but the building itself was designed and built largely by John Martin and also Charlie Thayer as well. I don't know how many tons of concrete they use for those walls, but if there's an atomic bomb due to go off, nuclear bomb going off, I'm going there, because that's going to outlive the insects, probably the cockroaches. Scott Milligan and Philip Rosenfeld spent literally countless of hours making the Shootman, said to be the largest of that design in the world. It was dedicated in his memory, and they had a nice big cake with a rendition of the observatory here, and the ribbon was cut by his two children at the dedication ceremony. Al Nagler, another Stellafane superhero. I was just talking to him up on the hill, like, this man is just incredible, incredible. He became first interested in astronomy by going to the Hayden Planetarium in New York City back in the late 40s or so, and that really caught him. That's him in high school. He went to the Bronx High School of Science, where he built an 8-inch F6.5 Newtonian weighing, yes, that's not a typo, weighing 350 pounds. Holy smokes. 1955 was his first Stellafane, and there he is today. He doesn't have the longest record here, though. He's probably off by one. At least I don't believe he does. 1958, though, he took third place in mechanical, a telescope with an alarm clock drive and a photo adapter hex tube and so forth. Alarm clock drive, interesting. 72, rather, he took first place in Newtonian design because of this 12.5-inch that had a perforated diagonal. There he's holding it there for the camera. The idea was you could hook up a telescope. There's you see the focuser up top right over there in the picture. You could set up a telescope, and it was designed such that 80% of the light from the telescope would go to the camera, and the other 20% would go to a guiding eyepiece, all while aimed at the same object. So, very innovative design. Well, that's why he won first place in Newtonians. Worked, though, professionally at Farland Optical, where he helped design optical components for the Gemini docking simulation and later the Apollo lunar landing simulators as well. Opened Teleview Optics in 1977, and actually by making projection lenses for big screen TVs, but shifted over to eyepieces. I like this ad from Sky and Telescope back in the day. If you can't read it, it says, here he is, leaning against the Nagler eyepiece. Very small print, it says, shown actual size. So, one of my favorite ads from back in that era. John Bortle, another name, attended countless Stellafanes into the 2000s. Okay? He's best known, of course, for the Bortle scale. You ever say, oh yeah, I'm looking at a Bortle 4 sky? That's the Bortle you're talking about. A way to objectively quantify the darkness of the nighttime sky. He really was a common and variable star observer. Par excellence for variable stars. Contributed uncountable observations to the AAVSO. 1970, he displayed these, I always drooled over these 15 by 80 driven binoculars, clock-driven binoculars. Oh, wow, that's pretty cool. Wrote, of course, Comet Digest for Sky and Telescope for the better part of a decade, or almost two and a half decades, I should say. Many presentations up here as well. Presented the Shadowgram during the Twilight Talks in 2015. Burt Willard, he holds the record for the most Stellaphanes. The club historian. Author, of course, the must-read book. Okay, you have a homework assignment, you gotta read that book. If you like Stellafane even a little bit, you gotta read that book. You'll love Stellafane after that. Absolutely. First attended 1954, his 67th convention. Unbelievable. I say very proudly, I've been here 51 conventions. His first convention was, again, I was minus 2 years old. So, wow, unbelievable. Took first place mechanical excellence for an 8-inch Newtonian. My favorite, though, that he ever entered was 1966, and again, I'm looking at it from photographs, not firsthand, of course, in a bowling ball. I thought that was just a cool design. John Dobson, of course, needs no introduction. He was here several years, gave presentations, so forth and so on. He founded the San Francisco Sidewalk Astronomers back in '68, after he left the monk order that he was a member of, and so forth. Devised the concept of low-cost, large aperture telescopes that anybody could make, using portholes for mirror blanks. He insisted, though, we should not call them Dobsonians, even though we all do. Should not call them Dobsonians. He said, for hundreds of years, a quote, wars were fought using cannons on Dobsonian mounts. He's absolutely right. Absolutely right. He always enjoyed also musing about the origin of the universe. He has some very interesting ideas, right? Like here's a quote. I love some of these quotes, though, real quickly. The importance of a telescope is not how big it is, it's not how made it is, it's how many people less fortunate than you got to look through it. Isn't that a great? You know, we are disciples of the universe, and that really captures that quality. Going off on the origin of the universe, the Big Bang people wanted to get everything out of nothing. They want us to believe that nothing made everything out of nothing. Okay? And this one he just happened to mention, somebody caught him saying it up here. I heard him say it too. When you're falling out of an airplane, there's no use blaming the ground. It kind of strikes me as funny. I don't know, I just think that's funny. An interesting character, if you ever heard him up here. Of course, he's no longer with us, but he is, in a sense, by video.
All right, first you need to know that the sidewalk astronomers are astronomical entertainers by appointment to Her Majesty, the American public. And years ago, if we had ever been properly funded, we would have taken the 24-incher on board a ship and taken it all around the world. Nobody ever funded us like that, and we never did it that way, but I'm very sorry about that. But what I have to say to the astronomers is, get your telescopes out for the rest, so the rest of the people who don't have telescopes can see where they got born. You see, this is a job for people to do who have the equipment. If you have the equipment to see things way out there, then let the rest of the people use your equipment so they all get a chance to see where they're born. As for the rest of the people, keep your eyes open. Keep your eyes open.
Interesting. But that was John Dobson. So a great presence no matter where he was, up here, wherever it was. But you know, those are, I mean, how could I possibly capture all the names in an hour's time? And I got 5 minutes to go. How could I possibly capture all the names of all of us who have contributed to the growth of Stellafane since its first, to the Springfield telescope makers before that first meeting in December of 1923? I couldn't possibly capture everybody. But you know who the real VIPs of Stellafane, those people, of course, but so are you. So am I. So are all of us. We're all VIPs up here at Stellafane. And I just want to close with a quick 3-minute musical finale. Take a look at the pictures. See if you recognize yourself or if you recognize anybody else. Whoop, why didn't that work? Oh, it started off so good. Hold on. Huh. Oh, such a good build-up. I can't blow that now. Hang on a minute. Why didn't that work? Talk amongst yourselves for a minute, okay? Oh, that's a blank slide. That can't be. Hold on. Oh, okay, so I just have shows the video instead of PowerPoint. That's okay. That'll work. Let me get back to my PowerPoint. Thank you. That's why Stellafane is so special to us. It's the people. The telescopes are great. The sky is wonderful. The people make it. You make it. I make it. We all make it. We are the Stellafane family. You know. And who knows, maybe 50 years from now, 100 years from now, some guy will come up and say, yeah, way back in 2023, this guy Harrington did some shtick, and he didn't know what he was talking about. But, you know, but you make Stellafane. I make Stellafane. To wrap it up real quick, with the sun setting over the turret telescope here, a quote from Russell Porter, read at the 1948 convention. He could not attend. He was out at Palomar Observatory with a 200-inch. Stellafane has a character all its own. There will never be another Stellafane. All I can say is amen. Thank you.